Hi, well, welcome to those who have joined so far. We'll expect some folks to struggle in a little bit later, but thank you for everybody who can make it. And if you're watching this later on recording, welcome. If you have questions, you can go to the Meetup Data Reboot channel in Locally Optimistic to put them there, and we'll keep your microphone on mute, please, during the call. And if we have time at the end, we'll definitely cover some Q&A. But otherwise, welcome. We are excited to, have a guided conversation today with Noel, Kelly, and Riff, hosted by myself, to talk about principles for setting about objectives around data architecture, choosing tools and design approach, advice for migrations, all kinds of stuff around this topic. And it's one that's near and dear to me. This event actually kind of took on a life of its own after I posted a question as I joined my new role and began exploring a data architecture reboot at Guitar Center. And this community gave a lot of advice that now we're eager to kind of dive into more deeply today together. So with that, I want to let the panel introduce themselves, a little bit about your experience, especially as it relates to having redesigned some architecture, and just overall where you're coming from. So Noel, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so I'm Noel Gomez, co-founder of Datacoves, but before Datacoves, I worked at a large biotech company, and we went through the whole digital transformation, moving to the cloud, implementing data catalogs, on and on. So that was my first foray into this topic. Since then, as part of Datacoves, I've been involved with multiple of these transformation topics, implementing Snowflake and dbt and all sorts of things like that. So breadth of experience in multiple different organizations, both large and small.
Awesome, thank you. Kelly.
Hello, thanks for having me here today. I'm Kelly Burdine. I am the director of data science and analytics at a health tech startup called Wellthy. I've been here for about 2.5 years. And I've been in data and analytics for a long time, but when I joined a sports technology company back in early 2015, and so at the time we were kind of starting an analytics function within the company. We had, before then it was just sort of spreadsheets, directly querying prod databases and stuff. And so, we'd spun up this little known tool at the time called Amazon Redshift and sort of built this infrastructure as we went, and learned a lot along the way about how to scale things and what doesn't work, especially as the tooling at the time was so just immature, and so it was just a hodgepodge of things. And then after that, I went to a different startup for a few years where I was the very first data hire. They had no analytics before that. And so I built something from scratch, which was much different than kind of where I'd previously come from, and I was able to apply a lot of those lessons learned. And then when I came to Wellthy a few years ago, they did have the kind of, I'd call it the beginnings of a data infrastructure. They certainly had the foundation in place. They had Snowflake, dbt, they had a BI tool and stuff, but it wasn't meeting a lot of their needs, and we had to do a major overhaul when I joined. And so I've kind of seen it at various ends of the spectrum. So excited to share that experience here today.
Thank you. And Riff, bring us home.
Thank you. So I'm Riff. I am also a fellow at Locally Optimistic, helping the admins with the community. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. Currently, I'm an independent consultant in analytics and data. Before that, I was head of data in a B2B SaaS company in the edtech space. And then before that, I started as an analytics engineer. By the time I had finished, I was more like a technical program manager in data. But that was a really interesting journey in that marketplace business where, yeah, there is like a lot of opportunity for data in where you're trying to match people, like sort of like Airbnb. So we did a data reboot there where had a stack, wasn't working out, started again from scratch, saw that build out, learned a lot. And by the time it left, I was focusing more on data culture initiatives, which was we were like happy with the platform, things were working well. We had failures along the way, but learned from it. But after we were happy with that platform, we were focusing more on the data culture side of things. And then when I was at the head of data, it was similar refactorings. There was already an established thing, but refactoring some of the approaches. But one interesting thing there was that this company was really interested in creating a data product for external customers. So that was a really interesting project where we wanted a product that we actually want to charge customers, and we also had to build this out, and we had to establish a data architecture that had to work with existing systems, some tech debt, and also integrate with front-end web analytics, so embedded analytics kind of problems. Yeah, and now I'm a consultant working in various clients. One, like to give you an idea, one very established construction business where it's a clean slate from them, starting from scratch, greenfield project. The other, a fashion startup in New York City, where it's just refactoring the setup, a bit of a mini reboot. So yeah, that's my background.
Well, thank you. Lots of experience for us to draw on as we dive into the conversation. I will add, for my own context, that currently I'm the VP of Data at Guitar Center, and I have recently gone through much of what we're about to talk about, and I'll be eager in about a year to tell people how it worked out. But when I joined, I had to assess what I had to solve for around our data platform, go through some tool selections where we ended up using Snowflake and Datacoves, locally optimistic connection, and then settle on a data modeling design pattern, relaunch all of our development process, embark on this development journey, and figure out how to make a successful migration, which we're beginning that journey now, but it was a lot to navigate. And so, starting at that beginning, I want to ask, and Kelly, we'll start with you, when you join a company or take on a project that has this really broad scope around like such a generic thing like data architecture, how do you go about getting clarity on the objectives so that you know what you're solving for and can kind of like then guide the rest of your initiatives?
Yeah, that's a good question because it can be so broad, and a lot of times it's not just one thing, right? There's a lot of moving pieces. And so, I think in my experience, the best thing to kind of start off doing is like really observing first and make sure you have a full understanding of how everything's working, why certain things were put into place, why certain processes are in place, and then trying to understand and really clearly define the objectives of what you're trying to do. So as an example, some things that I saw that Wellthy was really struggling with when I got going is like they were spending gobs of time in the BI tool. And, is it like, okay, is the BI tool the problem? Is it actually the modeling layer and it's not doing what we need it to do? Like what is happening here that we're spending so much time doing things that seem fairly straightforward or should be straightforward, but they just aren't. I had some guesses, but it was, I really had to ask questions and think through that and then go back and say, well, like, here's what we're actually trying to do. Because I think sometimes folks can get stuck in the weeds and miss the overall objective and and lose sight of that. And so I think that's like the really big thing to think about when you're doing it is just like really define those objectives, make sure you have alignment, of what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go. And then I'd also say, like, because again, it's unlikely to be like one thing, right? When you're thinking about these big initiatives or big overhauls or even just building out infrastructure from scratch, there's so many pieces to this. And so where do you start? And so, something that I've done that I found really helpful is you want a quick win. If you can find something that, maybe this is like a really big pain point, or, this is causing the most problems, or this is something I can knock out pretty quick and give everybody some relief, or everybody can see the progress being made, basically. Like, starting with that is a great way to kind of get some momentum with your team, show your stakeholders, show leadership. Hey, we said here's some problems, here's an objective of what we're trying to get to. Here's something we did real quick, and we saw progress. We saw improvement. That's a really good way to kind of sort of bite off a little piece and get going there.
Can you mention an example of like a quick win that you were able to find at your current company or at a past role?
Yeah, actually, so one thing that I remember tackling a few years ago is like we were not following a lot of best practices when thinking about modeling things. So, for example, we were doing a lot of transformations way downstream as opposed to upstream. And sort of like, if you use ZBT, you'll hear commonly say like a staging layer. But if you're dumping the raw data and you do these like initial transformations, and often there's like multiple layers, right, before you're aggregating up metrics and stuff. And so a lot of the transformations were happening even in the BI tool. And so it felt like people were just rewriting the same stuff over and over and over again. And so we went through and we're like, hey, here's like the most common things that we're seeing over and over again. Let's go move those all the way to that upstream model, that first kind of staging layer. And that really helped, right? Like, that really provided some relief for folks in our analysts in the BI tool, and not having to think about that. So that's one example of like a quick win. It didn't, we didn't have to think through it too hard. It was just kind of like, hey, we just kind of need to move this up and update the dependency. And so luckily in that case, we were able to do that fairly quick. But I'm sure other folks have plenty of other good examples of that as well.
Yeah, Noel, I'll come to you. Happy to hear you reflect on the quick wins topic. I saw you nodding along, but also the original question of kind of how you go about getting clarity to make sure that you know what you're solving for with your data architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's so many different things and so many directions that you can go. And if you're coming in, I think the immediate thing is whatever exists is not working. That's why you're being brought in, right? Because you're there to fix something. But I try to figure out like what's wrong with what you have, like, because if you don't understand the as is, it's hard to figure out the to be, and you will find that there's also terminology issues. So you'll hear people say like, oh, I need self-service BI or self-service analytics. What does that mean? And what kind of skill sets do I need? And so it ends up being multiple things. The larger the organizations, you have to also deal with change management and politics and people who feel like they should be doing something versus some other group. And so you need to really get a good lay of the land. What I have found that has worked is getting the different types of stakeholders together and really mapping out what is the as is, what is wrong with the as is, what are some measurable outcomes. So, for example, we're not very agile, but what does that really mean? Oh, it takes us 3 months to make some new data set available. Well, okay, let's see if we can improve that. And then come up with solutions. Because what you will find is that it's very rarely that the only thing that needs to be changed is a tool. So I've worked with some people where it's like, oh, we have problems with Redshift, it's slow, whatever. We'll just put in Snowflake. And but they're trying to solve for data being available in 3 months. I'm like, it's not Redshift that's making the data be available in 3 months. It's the processes and all this other stuff that needs to be tweaked as well. So I think you need to understand what are all the components versus the things that are affecting what you want and what else needs to change. And it isn't just the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, the key, talking to stakeholders. Kelly mentioned, observing first. Feel like, there's a theme there. Riff, how do you go about tackling that? And what other advice do you have for, clarifying your objectives?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to reiterate that, aligning with the key stakeholders is like really, really important. And I love that. And I've used this before about what it is and where we want to be. Kind of a picture, that clear picture really helps. I'll say the quick wins is also a big one, because I think it's the way I look at it is you have to create trust quickly, and trust creates speed in my mind. And so those key stakeholders, you want to establish trust with them. And so getting those quick wins is really important. The other thing I can think of, or examples, is maybe not around maybe more around the practice of things. I've come into places where there's so much happening with the data team where you can't even do anything because there's all these things happening. And that's usually because an example would be like they have this way of working where they have a channel for the data team, and it's called like data requests, and anyone in the company can like ask anything. And you're like, oh, okay, well, this takes up a lot of time. How are we going to even do anything if we have this like ad hoc way of doing things? So sometimes it's coming in and just with the objective of like creating space so that you can actually start aligning with your stakeholders. So that's a bit of like cultural management, change management. And then when you have that space, it's when it comes to aligning, it's one thing I do when it comes to aligning is that really challenge people. It's almost like I'm being that annoying kid of like, ask a question. It's like, oh, okay, well, why is this important? And then there's the next thing, then, well, why? And then that kind of like makes people think and get down to the actual reason why we're doing something. So yeah, I
It's
can get a bit
the old stereotype of the 5 whys. Keep asking
exactly,
why.
exactly.
Riff and
I-
Noel, I think quick wins is such a common theme in a lot of projects, whether it's data architecture or any other major change that you are pursuing. Do either one of you want to share an example like Kelly did around where you've been able to deliver a quick win?
So the way that I've seen it is taking things from slide to something more tangible. So because I've worked in these large enterprises, you have, I call it decision by committee. A lot of people are having their input, and we will take slides and go from, we have 10 boxes and we're going to make it 5 boxes, but nothing is real. It's just a lot of stuff. The fastest way that you can get people aligned is to actually show them, because what you will find is you'll talk to many vendors and many companies out there, and they'll sell you a dream. Like, this is how it can be. But the reality is up to you. Like, it's up to you to make that dream a reality. And how hard or how simple that is, you're not going to know until you get your hands dirty. So you need to get in there and doing a quick MVP, and I've done this in as little as 6 weeks, where you can show them, here's what the future can look like. It doesn't mean that you'll get there overnight, but at least you're going away from slides and you're building some credibility and you're showing that this can work. And more importantly, you need to get that leadership support, because I've seen it where you try doing things bottom up and you get stuck, because it requires multiple players and multiple people to be aligned. And I've been in situations where I was about to just say, like, if you want to change, you have to change. It can't just be lip service, right? A lot of people say, like, oh, we're open-minded, we want to do this. But when you challenge something, you'll hit an obstacle. They'll say like, well, we can't change this because of X. We can't change that because of Y. Well, if you're not changing anything, you'll end up exactly where you are. And so you need leadership to say, yes, we're going to take that risk. Yes, it does. And I think, part of it is because they don't want to take risk, right? Because no matter how bad a process is, it's kind of working. It's fear of the unknown. And so they may just fear changing anything because something may break. And you go like, yeah, something may break, but it's okay. We got to take chances. We got to do something different if we want to experience something better.
I heard in there you mentioned a key principle around, getting executive sponsorship to really drive the change directive. Kelly, one of your first things you said, I think fits into the bucket of, principles of these kind of projects around observe first. What are some other principles that you keep in mind as you embark on a major data reboot that helps, the project overall be successful just through how you operate?
Yeah, I think one thing that I always like to do is like have a lot of transparency with where you're going, what you've accomplished so far, sharing out those wins, with all the stakeholders, not just internally. Riff mentioned, he said something about trust. This is a huge thing, and especially if you're trying to kind of overhaul some architecture or even trying to build something from scratch, it takes time. And so you have to have stakeholder trust. You have to have their buy-in. And so, sometimes, in the beginning, sometimes you're lucky and you have that one advocate for you in leadership, and they may be behind you and are rooting for you and stuff. And so it's like, okay, great. But if you fail to bring everybody else along and show that transparency of like, here's the progress we're making, here's where we're going. Sometimes it's not going to go as well as you hope. Sometimes, you hit some obstacles along the way, you learn. But I think having that transparency and is really key, and it's key to keeping everybody aligned and keeping that trust with those stakeholders, and keeping that buy-in. And then I just want to hit on something Noel said too, which is like trying it out and making it real. There are so many different ways to build data infrastructure, and there are so many tools out there, it's wonderful. There's not one right way, and there's not one suite of tools that just works for everybody. My data stack, I've of course hit obstacles in my career, but I've found success at every company, and every data stack has looked slightly different. So there's different ways to do it. And you can debate all day, but sometimes you won't know until you just try it. And so, yeah, like get rid of the decision by committee. You're not always going to agree. You're not going to get everybody to say, yes, that's the best way to do it. And, if you're transparent, you build that trust, you keep everybody aligned with what you're doing, what you're trying, where you're having success, people will come along and they'll say, oh, okay, we tried that, didn't work out. We can quickly pivot to something else. We can try that. We're making progress, and you just kind of keep rolling, and you build up the momentum, you get those wins, and you keep chugging along. I've learned the hard way of like, hey, we need some extra time. We need to make some room. We're not going to be able to do as much ad hoc stuff because we got these big initiatives. Like, trust me, I'm going to do this. And, I parts of my career, I failed to kind of keep leadership abreast of like what is going on and where we're going and the progress that we're making. And so they're like, what is the data team doing over there, right? And you don't want that. So yeah, I think that the transparency is a big thing, big principle to keep in mind.
Yeah, I was going to add with that trust thing, the other thing is building credibility. So you come into a new organization and you're new to the organization, but that a lot of the players have been around a long time. And so, Mike comes in and goes like, oh, we need to fix this and whatever. It's like, okay, I've been down this road before, it has failed or whatever. And so how is Mike going to be any better than Mike 2 mics ago or something like that. And so showing that your approach is different, that you're open to listening or building those bridges, I think all of that plays into that, building that trust.
As a really random aside, but the 2 mics ago makes me remember that my wife's boyfriend before me was also Mike. So I was Mike 2.0. All right. So thanks for jumping in on that. And, Kelly, I feel like I certainly echo the transparency from my own experience. And I would put a word on you talked about getting things out there, just be willing to take action. It's like experiment, do see what works. Riff, what are some other principles that you want to add to the conversation around, making sure that that guide how you approach these major data projects?
Yeah, when you asked about like the quick wins and principles, the thing that comes to mind, and I guess this is coming to mind just because it's a bit of a counterintuitive thing coming from an engineering background around that storytelling aspect. So a quick win I had was around coming to the new company, talk to people, talk to the data team, and it's like, okay, what we're going to do in an all hands where everyone's attending, we're going to tell a story about our team, and where we're going to head. And so that got people's attention. But it's still really important to have those transparency, as we've been talking about, to show that progress. But that was an interesting thing where the quick win for me was just a slide deck and presenting it in all hands, because I was using stories, imagery, things like metaphors like, hey, we're like Pokemon metaphors, like we're Charmander now, but we're gonna be Charizard. That's where we want to head. And like that, to that audience, it worked and got their attention and got them excited. And it felt like, the CEO was commenting on the storytelling aspect, so it got his attention. So that was like an interesting quick win, but you have to follow through with that, of course. So you have to have those recurring meetings with the key stakeholders, show progress, so that they can see and they have that trust in you to deliver.
Yeah, it makes sense. And one principle I could add that I'm thought of based on your thought about telling stories, and based on that audience, your Pokemon metaphor worked. I've learned to try, still getting better at it, but to adapt to your audience. So it's a really important principle in these major projects that what matters to your CFO is not the same thing as what matters to your head of marketing director, is what matters to your frontline operations guy who's using your reports, and adapting your approach or will yield better results for your project. As we pivot into a more tangible aspect of the conversation, I'm going to start with you, Noel, as the owner of a tooling company. How should people, as they embark on these journeys around data reboots, and like you said, it's rarely only the tool, but sometimes you do need either a different tool, or in my case, we didn't even have any Git or DBT or Airflow equivalents. So we have nothing. What are we going, we have to fill a gap. How would you advise people approach the process of choosing tools?
Find a trusted advisor. I would say the hardest part of this, and Kelly brought this up earlier, there's so many tools, there's so many options. I challenge anybody to take a given subject, let's say a data catalog or a data warehouse or something like that, and look at the marketing material from each company, and they'll look exactly the same. You are not going to be able to tell the difference between A and B. And that's because these tools have to distill. And like I said, I have to do the same thing. So somebody looking at our website can tell, how are we different than X? And I think that that's the hard part. So when you're starting down this journey and you're going from something radically different, so you may be coming from a traditional legacy stack, SQL Server, SSIS, all that kind of stuff, and now you hear all the cool kids talking about DBT and Snowflake and all of these things. There's so much for you to learn, and there's so much that you don't even know you don't know, that I think that's a huge challenge for anyone starting out. And so having someone that you can trust that's going to tell you the reality of things. The reality may be you're not ready for that. Your organization isn't ready for that. You're biting off more than you can chew. You have a small department, or you don't have the skills. So I want to use DBT, but no one's going to write any SQL. Okay, well, these two don't go together. Or I want a data catalog, but descriptions and all that other stuff doesn't magically appear, and so it requires this change in the culture and who's going to own things. So I would say that to me, that's number one, is having someone that'll tell you the reality of things, and then getting an idea of what are all the pieces. Like once you start understanding, it's like, what does Airflow do? What does DBT do? Or what does it not do? Why do you need these different tools? Or why don't you need these tools? What are the other options? Because you want to look at what you need today, but also forecast what you're going to need in a year. So as you mature, now you're going to need flexibility, or the team's going to grow, new data sources, whatever it is. And am I going to be constrained to certain things? So there's all of these kinds of things. I've also seen where people want to do data modeling different ways. So we talked about data modeling. It's like, okay, do we do facts and dimensions? Do we use Data Vault? Do we use one big table? Okay, well, maybe you need all of them. Maybe you need only one of them or two of them. But understanding what that is, and it's more than a term, because a lot of people will understand things very superficially, right? So, oh yeah, I've heard a lot of people like Data Vault, so I should do Data Vault, but I don't know what Data Vault is, and so how can I even make a decision? And so I think it's that education thing that you need to accelerate.
All right, on behalf of our audience, though, I'm not going to let you get away with your number one piece of advice. Find a trusted advisor. And besides going to Locally Optimistic and saying, can anyone help? What are some pathways that you would suggest for finding someone who's a good advisor around navigating tooling decisions?
So I would look at, I'll tell you how I used to do it. So when I had to build this application, I wanted to use this framework called Ruby on Rails. And I knew sort of like general why I wanted to do these things, but I was no expert in this. What I did is I followed people in the community. I saw what articles they wrote. I saw, what expertise they shared. And I knew that, these people at least gave me the impression that they knew what they were talking about. And so I went with them. And I said, okay, well, they definitely know more than I do. They seem, to have a process. And that was it. The other thing, by the way, is when I interviewed people, I would see like, how do they go from A to Z? It wasn't just like, I need a website. It's like, okay, how are you going to uncover the requirements? And they walked me through that process and how they've done it with other customers and all that kind of stuff. And so that built some credibility. And I can tell you, I remember choosing two because at that time I needed to build two applications. And I said, I'm going to try two people. And one of them worked out and one of them didn't work out. And so that's what I would say. You can find consultants who've been around this space for a long time, ask for recommendations of other people who have done this before, and go with that.
Okay, so there's a good advice, looking for like publishers and communities, consultants, asking the vendors themselves for who's done this, who can they connect you with. It's good. Kelly,
the one thing I'll warn about the vendors is they'll tell you they're partners, but they may have many partners and they're not all created equal. And so I would just be careful with that. I would make sure that the problem I've seen with vendors is they'll bring the best people to talk to you, but they won't put the best people on your project. So how do you make sure that you're going to get those best people after you sign the contract?
Makes sense. Kelly, turning to you to think about, as you've had to navigate tool selection processes and either filling a gap or making a replacement, what have been some keys to how you've gone about that?
Yeah, Noel had several good points about obviously reaching out to get opinions from people other than the salesman you might be speaking with, who says nothing but good things about that tool. I would also say, really planning a good evaluation. I think generally speaking, what folks do is they say, okay, here's the tool landscape. There's these 5 or 6 tools that, at first glance kind of meet the basic requirements that we might have. And then a lot of tools offer maybe a free trial or something where you can kind of give it a go. But where I have found the most success is when you take the time to have a real clear rubric, an evaluation rubric of here's the must-haves. You might have some nice to haves on that list. And then before you even go into a trial, like you need that rubric. You need to know and have a plan of exactly how you are going to evaluate that tool. It's really hard to get a full understanding of a tool in a 14-day free trial. There's just going to be things you miss, and you want to maximize that time. And so, for example, let's say you're evaluating BI tools. What are you going to go in and build in that BI tool? That's, do you want to put that most important dashboard together? You want to take the data that you're modeling out, like don't use the demo data that they put in there that's so clean and perfect and they know it works perfectly. Like you want a clear use case defined, you want an evaluation matrix, you want to know who is going to help evaluate that tool. Also, are there people outside the data team that are going to use this tool? Like a BI tool, for example, you're going to have all different stakeholders. So when I do those, I have someone from our customer success team, someone from our marketing team, like whoever's using that, I want them in there. I want their opinions as an end user, right? If it's, sometimes you might have engineers working in your data warehouse. Sometimes, there's different folks that might be helping out and touching these tools. And so it's important to get their opinions too. I've seen too many people where the data team evaluates it, they think it's great for them. It ends up not being good for their end users. Or they go in, they test it out for a couple weeks. They're like, yeah, it seems like it solves some of our problems. But they miss some like key requirements, and those become major pain points. I think a lot of us have probably seen when you get a tool in your stack, it can be very difficult to replace because there are so many dependencies. And so it's, some stuff are maybe easier to replace than others, but especially if it's like a data warehouse, your ETL tool, your transformation tool, those ones are difficult to replace. Those are, what do they say? Like a 2-way door versus a 1-way door. Like it's not exactly a 1-way door. You can come back, but it's hard. So,
Yeah.
Do your homework, take the time to really plan out that evaluation and that, whether it's a trial, test use case, month to month, whatever it is, like make sure you have a really clear objective use case. You evaluate them apples to apples and fill that matrix out.
It certainly resonates with me. Actually, the next piece I mentioned in the intro where we've gotten so far. The next piece, we actually are doing a BI evaluation and we're planning a POC right now. and so I absolutely second that. You gotta make the most of it, and you gotta bring in the right people so that you can. With the way I've explained it to people as we're preparing is we need to make sure that we don't end up choosing something and then 3 months down the line being like, wait, it can't do this. and And like we gotta, try to avoid that as best we can and really think of those edge cases that are important, even if they're an edge case. Riff, how have you gone about the tool selection process across, all these data reboot aspects, whether it's development tooling, warehousing, ML, or BI?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a challenge because there's so much out there right now. But I think like taking a step back, one thing like another principle I've used is that whole idea of separation of concerns, like a software engineering thing where, I tend to compartmentalize products to a particular stage. So, you have data ingestion, data storage and warehousing, transformation, data visualization, because in the past I've come in and I know I can see some data visualization product not being suitable for end users because it's too complicated. This was more for like data science people, not business users. But unfortunately, there's all this logic in these reports, and so what we had to do was like, okay, take out this logic, put it in the transformation layer, compartmentalize that, and then that way you've got a way you can, like, if something's not working in the future, something changes, you can hopefully easily switch. So like that separation of concerns is something I've always used. Had it in the back of my mind. Again, double down on the evaluation metric. I think that or the approach, because you can just be objective and less emotional about things and not get swayed by marketing. The other thing is, this was like kind of a blind spot for us, but these assumptions we make on the users of these different platforms. So, certainly with business users, we had this vision that they'll be able to do self-service, create all these reports. But then when it's out there, you're like, oh, actually, no, they need better tooling or more training or or a combination of those two. So I've sort of like lightly started doing for these data initiatives, like sort of like just a light touch user persona for each of these tools. Like, would they truly like use these? What assumptions are we making out of these? What do they actually need to have in terms of skills as well, to actually use these tools, and we can get value out of these tools. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I can share a story for myself of a failure in this area where at a past company I was trying to solve for data cataloging, and we went through an evaluation. We chose a tool, but something we underestimated it relates to your point about user personas. How are they going to use it? Was we underestimated the adoption burden of having a separate tool, and the difficulty of getting people to integrate something brand new into their regular workflows. And it ultimately doomed it because we just couldn't get adoption. So yeah, I got to look out for, like, really think ahead to who's going to use your tool. And a lot of great points in there around planning that evaluation, figuring out what you need, taking that longer view of making sure you're solving not just for today, but for next year and 3 years from now. And of course, as Noel started us on finding a trusted advisor. I'll turn now to a key part that I had to assess when I started, because I knew that we were in a white space here at my company where we had an old data model and a new data model, and the old data model was old, but people liked it. The new data model was new, but nobody was really satisfied or using it. How do we go about thinking about modeling our data? And Noel, you touched on this, like star versus data vault versus one big table. And just even thinking, like, even if you choose star, then the next level down is, okay, well, how do I model my data? Like, how have you kind of unpacked that problem of data modeling within your data reboot strategy as you face these problems? So I guess we can start with you, Noel.
Yeah, so the way I look at it is, don't go for something fancy if you can't support something fancy. By that, I mean that if you go with something that's more common, that you're going to have more people understand easily, etc., then that might be the right path for you. In certain parts of the world, Data Vault is more ingrained. There's more people who know it or something like that. But you go to the US and there's less of those people. So I'm not saying don't use Data Vault, but understand that you also need to deal with training, and there's other components than just picking a data model. But the inverse also applies. So some people say, well, I'll just do one big table because that's easy. Everybody will have everything that they need, and you have this giant cube. But that's not very usable. You'll end up with things that have 300 columns or something, and nobody will be able to decipher anything. We try to suggest something that's in between. So thinking about the data value chain, and start with staging models, create core models, your facts and dimensions, and then create data marts. And that's actually where the Datacoves thing came from, because when I worked at large enterprises, I used to work with accounts payable teams, and they were doing self-service in Excel. How did they do it? They got extracts out of SAP, vendors, purchase orders, invoices, and they used VLOOKUPs, and they did anything that they wanted. Except that at some point that became too much data for Excel, was too slow. So then the enterprise solution to them was go to the enterprise data warehouse. So they go from having, I don't know, 5 files to here's a billion things, modeled a different way. And it's along those lines of like, yeah, what they have may not have been efficient, but they understood it. And now we're giving them something that may be more efficient, but it's completely foreign to them. And what we said, the Datacoves is, you just create a schema, give them what they want, give them what they need, even if you have modeled it a different way upstream of that. So I think you can have your cake and eat it too if you really plan it out.
Kelly, how would you build on that? How have you thought about making modeling design choices?
Yeah, I think really thinking through how the data is being consumed and where it's being consumed. Because different your audience matters. So I think, Noel, like you were touching on that a little bit for sure, of like, your finance team might be a little more data savvy than, say, your, I don't know, a marketing team or something like that. And so your audience really matters, and so it's important to understand where their knowledge is, where their skills are at, and how you can surface that data in a way that makes sense to them. And then again, the tool matters. So for example, I have an engineer at her last company. She made big, huge, wide tables for everything, and that's what worked really well for there. She came to Wellthy, and our tool does a really good job of kind of dynamically aggregating metrics. And so we found, and it also has a really good drill down feature. So the big wide table actually wasn't working out so well. Even though it worked fantastic at her last organization, you can't really drill down because things are pre-aggregated. And we didn't need to do those joins ahead of time, because it joined really well there and it was efficient in our tool. And so like that matters as well. So you need to understand kind of the technology you have, and so again, like where it's being consumed. You need to know how it's being consumed and the questions that folks are asking, right? Because are they going to need to drill down? How are they going to be aggregating this data? What kind of metrics are they going to be calculating? And so obviously different types of modeling is more efficient for different types of questions, and again, the tools that you're using. And so those are the things that I like to think about when I'm figuring out kind of the best way to model out my data.
I think you kind of really touched on a principle that works well for so many projects beyond just even data modeling or data architecture, around learning to adapt our experience and expertise into whatever your current context is. Like that, you said your engineer had seen so much success, but she had within the new context, they have to adapt. So Riff, how have you approached the modeling strategy challenge?
Yeah, I think I'm a bit more opinionated than others when it comes to, I have a certain way, and I usually follow the like Kimball/dimensional modeling way. Although recently I came into a company where the approach was one big table, and I was a bit of a naysayer in the beginning, but then I understood finally, okay, I understand why this is the case. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think like Kimball is good, I find, and I'm doing this project now where I want to test this out, like a hybrid method where I think Kimball is good for those downstream, for data analysts, engineers to compose things in a way so that they understand the business process and context. But it's still so composable that you can actually build those one big table still, which are useful, well, from my experience, for those reverse ETL tools. It seems like I've seen use cases where, because of the end user or even a consumer app that gets fed the data warehouse, one big table, there is an advantage in those. So I'm trying this new approach, a hybrid approach of like downstream, let's have it, dimensional models, and then depending on who the end user is, it can be one big table or dimensional models or something in between. Yeah, that's something I'm trying out, and I will let everyone know how that goes. I'll share with the community.
Well, in the spirit of sharing, I mentioned earlier we had to make this. Our choice that we settled on was mostly just an updated version of the old model, a lift and adjust / lift and a shift kind of thing. But with an eye on the clock, we'll do one last lightning round, like 1 minute each, where we'll kind of combine the pre-planned agenda. Where I'd love to hear from each of you, kind of your top like tips and tricks for the migration and change management process itself. Like, okay, we've walked through the journey of, you understand what you're solving for. You've kind of established some principles of how to approach it. You've chosen some tools and some modeling strategy, and you're embarking on this major initiative. How do you find success in the long run with migrations and changes that you need to stick? So Kelly, why don't you start us off? Like, what's your top advice?
Oh, well, I already used my quick win trick. That's one of my go-tos, is showing some quick value right out the gate. The other thing I'll hit on real quick is, a few of us here are definitely speaking from like a leadership management perspective. But that doesn't mean if you're an individual contributor that you can't help change and lead a data initiative or get one started and get buy-in. And something that someone did to me a long time ago was there was this new approach to doing something. And he kind of mentioned to me, and I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. Like, maybe we can try that sometime. He just went and did it, and he brought it back to me and showed me what he did. And I was like, okay, now I get it. That's awesome. And so sometimes like show and tell is much better than just kind of, hey, here's an interesting article if somebody did, or here's this new marketing blog on this new feature or this new tool or whatever. And so if you're an individual contributor and you want to get some buy-in and you want to help like sort of start a data initiative, doing a little quick use case show and tell is a great way to go about doing it and convince some folks to try it out.
Love it. Prototyping. Riff, what's your top advice for the whole migration change management approach?
So a counterintuitive idea that thing that I've learnt is just over communicating to people. I guess that's like a thing I've had to deal with, because every time I'm like repeating something, like, oh, they're just gonna get bored. Like they're just I'm saying the same thing, but then what I realize is that people have different perspectives. They forget things really easily. There's so much happening usually, so it's actually okay to over communicate and remind them and repeat yourself.
It'd be a whole nother talk on communication strategy and getting people to actually pay attention. But we don't have, we're going to be out of time. So Noel, your
Yeah.
tips and tricks for this aspect.
So one thing that we have to be able to communicate is that this is not a sexy part of the business, right? Everybody wants the Gen AI, the LLM, machine learning, pretty dashboards, all of that. But what we're talking about is really a foundation that needs to be a solid foundation to build all this stuff on. So you need to communicate that. And I know we talked about this before, but having those metaphors, getting away from the technology and talking to people about how this is different. So I mentioned before about empowering people and risk. And one thing that I talk about is you don't want people cutting tomatoes with spoons because you're afraid that they're going to cut themselves. What you want to say is you want to teach them knife skills. You want people to use knives, and some people may cut themselves, but it's not the end of the world. And so we need to be able to allow that to happen. And so put it in terminology that's not technical, that's not about data, but that people can relate to, because it's the easy bake oven to teaching your child to use a real oven. That's what I like to think about.
I like that, and it's a great place to end it on. It ties back to something we touched on earlier around, adapting to your audience. You, in this case, using their language or using at least some kind of metaphor that they will understand. And Riff's point about over-communication ties back to earlier emphasis on transparency and building trust through communication. And then Kelly made a callback around, observe first, but then experiment, take action, get some quick wins. And so a lot of great points. I hope that those who were able to attend and those who may watch this recording later found this valuable, as so many of us will have to face major data reboot initiatives in our careers, and we navigate what is the objective, how are we going to approach this, what tools and choices are we making, for the unsexy foundation, and then we dive in and we make it a reality. And so appreciate the time, Riff, Kelly, and Noel, and thank you everybody who could join. And yeah, we look forward to more engaging events through Locally Optimistic. Thank you for making this happen.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.